Welcome back to King Pilled, folks. I am Matt, your host and humble narrator for the day, to quote my good friend Buck Johnson. And today I am joined with the shampoo mogul himself, Mr. Charles Haywood. Thank you for joining us today, sir.
I am pleased to be here.
Great. This is. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time, and I think it's coming at just the right time. We're streaming right now on YouTube, on Twitter, and on Facebook, and then you can catch this later on the podcast feed as well. Just look for King Pilled. Cooper, if you guys are watching the channel regularly, you know that Cooper is missing. He is stuck being a wagey, which he's trying to get himself out of right now. He got held late at work today, but he's hustling home, and he'll be hopping on here in a little bit. So I think anybody who's listening to this channel, I'm sure they already know who you are, either because they're coming here to see you right now, or everyone that is with this channel already is very familiar with you. But in the event that we happen to have someone who doesn't know who you are, tell us who you are and what you've got going on.
I'm Charles Haywood. I write at my own site, The Worthy House, theworthyhouse.com, which is all free. I am not looking for your subscription, and I write on history and politics. I write book reviews primarily, or rather my own thoughts masquerading as book reviews. And so, as I say, it's mostly history and politics. I also show up on Twitter off and on at The Worthy House. Normally, I try to be off Twitter for Lent, but I've realized that Twitter is really my only source of news, pretty much. And so I'm not sure I can get off Twitter for Lent. So that may cause my eternal soul to suffer. But I may have to stay on Twitter for Lent. It's an upcoming decision I have to make.
Yes, I selfishly I hope that you can remain on Twitter because I want to keep seeing what you have to say.
I'll probably cut it back to just being off Twitter entirely for Holy Week, because really, if you can't stay off Twitter for Holy Week, what are you doing?
Yeah, right.
Unless, of course, there's a nuclear war or something that's really super important, or something like a real happening.
Right. Yes, a real happening. It's one of the things I want to talk with you about here today is there seems to be a debate going on amongst it. It seems to have died off a little bit. It sort of reached a bit of a fever pitch during the Texas border situation recently. But it seems kind of like our little corner of the internet, I don't know what you would call some right-wing dissident, neo-reactionary, conservative, something along those lines. We kind of know who we're talking about. It seems to be splitting between the group of people who are saying nothing's happening, nothing's going to happen, this is all a big nothing burger, and something's happening, there's very much something going on that's different, things are changing, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And a guy we very much appreciate, Mr. Fisted by Foucault, he actually decided to post a poll on this a couple weeks ago. Actually, he said you wanted to post it.
I told him he should run a poll.
Yeah. Okay, so you bullied him into it. And he said...
I bullied Charlie. I mean, that's exactly what happened.
Well, using your powers for good. He posted a poll. He said, is Texas an actual happening or a not happening? Got 2,700 votes. 57.3% of people said a not happening. And in one of the comments, he replied to define what a bar for happening is. He said, something of significance actually happening, like Biden sending in the Fed/troops, or Texas cutting off all ties with Washington, or violence, etc. So far, it's just politicking. So you obviously disagreed with him, at least in his premise before he posted this. What's your take on that?
Well, it's a very complex topic, but working backwards, first of all, that poll is bogus because he's a noted happenings denier, and he hosted the poll. So therefore, that gooses the statistics. So my contention is net 15 points should be moved, thus meaning that his poll actually came out my side, that is the happening side, winning, once you normalize it for the fact that he's a denier. So he's also not just a denier of happenings. He has this, I like Soldo, but Nicola Soldo is his real name. I like him, but he has this insane idea of turbo America, that America has never been stronger or more dominant in the world at large. And on both turbo America and on happenings, he's always moving the goalposts, right? The goalposts are always what's not happening now is a happening, so therefore there is no happening. Now, this is called sophistry. This is not any kind of objective analysis. You can, in fact, have an objective analysis about whether things are happening, but to declare what the goalposts are for a happening ex post and declare there's therefore no happening is frankly kind of a silly exercise. So we can work backwards on two. Like we can all agree that certain things are happenings. When the aliens arrive and step out of their spaceship, that's a happening. When the nuclear bombs start dropping, that's a happening. Haywood cutting his toenails, not a happening. So I mean, there's a wide range between those things, and people of good faith can disagree on what constitutes what. But it's objectively true that the Texas events, for example, were unprecedented in modern American history. And I back in the day, used to be went to law school. I knew a fair bit and worked for a federal judge, so I know a fair bit about constitutional law as well as history. I mean, completely unprecedented in the modern era. And just because people aren't actually shoving guns in each other's faces doesn't mean that it's not unprecedented in the modern era. So by any kind of reasonable, objective analysis, that's a happening. I mean, again, colloquially, it's happening. If your definition of happening is dead people, well, that not something particularly one should wish for, and second of all, not something that is, for example, another kind of happening that would be a happening but does not involve violence would be the extremely unlikely that the Supreme Court takes Donald Trump off of the ballot or allows Donald Trump to be taken off of the ballot in different states, because the bizarre, unprecedented nature of that would be a happening. And most typically, happenings are ubiquitous for quite some time, months or years before there is some major societal change. So to say, well, you have to have a major societal change, say the end of communism in 1989, and that's a happening, and everything that happens before that is not a happening, again, that's kind of sophistry. What you can debate whether any individual thing is a happening, but there's really no sound argument that the Texas events were not a happening.
Do you think we possibly are suffering from an excessive reoccurrence of happenings, and it's kind of distorted our ability to assess what actually constitutes a happening and what doesn't? It's kind of like, it seems like we've had 50 years of history happen in the last 10 years.
Right. Well, it's the old Lenin phrase there: decades when nothing happens, and weeks when decades happen. I think we have not had a lot of happenings in this sense in the past several years. That is, we have a lot. I think what it is distorted by is a combination of the internet and people being dumbasses that make the news cycle both extremely rapid and extremely incoherent. So a lot of things that really aren't happenings look like happenings because people get all wound up about them for a very brief period of time. And to distinguish between that and a real happening really requires looking at the underlying structural elements. And you can, some things maybe count for both and so on. There's a large gray area there. But I don't think we've had a lot of happenings. All the happenings that are relevant are quite recent, and most of them are in the past year. And I always make this point. I'm a little bit at risk. I apologize to any listeners because I've noticed I've been starting to repeat myself on podcasts, and pretty soon people are going to be like, that Haywood guy, he's so one-dimensional. All he does is repeat the same crap. What a loser. And then click. So sorry if I'm repeating myself, but if you had looked at us in 18 months ago and described what's happened since then, we would have described those things as happenings. And that wouldn't have been true if we took ourselves, say, 8 years ago and looked forward 4 years or 18 months or whatever. What that tells about the future is, of course, hard to say. But in this kind of thing, past performance is, in fact, if not a guarantee of future results, at least a reasonable predictor of future results.
This is actually a subject that we've been discussing in the King Pill Discord. We do voice chats in there, and we just sit and just endlessly discuss these sorts of things. And one of the things we were talking about is a lot of people want to go back to the 1950s, the 1990s, somewhere in between. And for those people, like if you took someone in the 50s and you described what the world would look like in the 90s, they would have found it surreal and maybe hard to believe. If you took someone in the 50s and you described it and you described the world as it is today to someone in the 50s, it would be incomprehensible to them. They would find it absolutely preposterous. Yet at the same time, if you took the world of today and you described it to somebody even 10 years ago, you're still going to get the same type of effect. Like you're saying, you can even go to 18 months. And so there's something that is happening. There's a phenomenon here that if you took someone from the 1510s and then described the world to them in the 1530s, it's going to be much closer in terms of resemblance than 2000 is to 2024. So what do you think is the thing that's happening? What's this thing that's changing?
The West is reaching the inevitable end of the Enlightenment project. You can look at this from different angles. I, for example, fall into the camp of people who are not opposed to progress, particularly technological progress, as an ongoing, permanent thing, but that has nothing whatsoever to do with the Enlightenment. So the age of the West, as mutated by the Enlightenment, is coming to its inevitable end because it was poisoned from the beginning. And so you can look at that or phrase that in different ways. The simplest way to phrase it is that the era of, I would call it the Enlightenment left, you might call it just plain liberalism. These things are all the same thing. The era of liberalism, that is the worship of individual autonomy and egalitarianism, is coming to a crashing end because it was always doomed. And what will come out the other end is something that is based on reality as opposed to the Enlightenment. And we will all forget, except for the history books, that the so-called Enlightenment ever happened. And we'll all live happily ever after, or as happily as human beings can, when they're not distorted by BS ideologies like the Enlightenment.
So how would you differentiate then between the Enlightenment and, say, the Whig view of history? How would you differentiate that from a positive view of technological progress, as you suggested?
The Whig view of history, it kind of fits within the Enlightenment. Certainly, you could imagine taking a Whig view of history out of the Enlightenment, however, as well. But you could, for example, stick it pre-Enlightenment and say, look, things are improving on the following metrics, and therefore they're going to keep improving. So I think that, in particular, in things like scientific achievement, those things are, of course, completely unrelated on a simply historical level to the so-called Enlightenment, which is a political system mostly fleshed out in the mid-1700s. This scientific revolution began long before that. In fact, there's a very strong argument we'd have much greater scientific advancement if the Enlightenment had never happened and if the West had not gone completely off track in the 20th century. I mean, you can imagine that scenario. That's not necessarily the case. There is a counter argument, which I also find fairly powerful, which is that you were asymptotically approaching the limitations on return from scientific advance, because you don't want to have the first step fallacy, that just because you step towards all sorts of new things like fusion or anti-gravity or something, just because you can imagine the first step, that means the final step is achievable. It may be the case that mankind is tapped out, that we're not going to have a lot more scientific advancement. We're going to run out of fossil fuels, like John Michael Greer says, and then we're going to have to lump it. Well, maybe, but what we're not going to have to lump is the horrible burden of having Enlightenment-based political systems, leftist-based political systems placed on us. So even if we have to go back to the world where steam power is more common than it is now, that's going to be a huge improvement over what we have now. I'm basing my prognosis for the future being more positive on technological improvement. I just think technological improvement is also possible.
Okay, I like that differentiation there. Our good friend, mutual friend Jason from the 2-Bit podcast, I think he said something like liberalism is a civilization dissolver. It's basically like when you introduce liberalism into a situation, it just goes to work like an acid, dissolving all of the bonds that bind people together, and which is what actually creates a civilization in the first place. So he's been developing this system of thought sort of toward the idea that we no longer have a civilization. We've actually descended into the equivalent of primal tribes in a very sophisticated concrete jungle who we're hitting each other with rocks, and our rocks just happen to be a little more advanced than past rocks. How does your Orthodox faith plug into this? Mr. Patriarch in the chat says, when will Matt address the OQ? Why are the Orthodox overrepresented among rightist content creators? Name the O. How does your familiarity with Eastern thought through Orthodoxy, and how is the taking on the Orthodox phronema, as they say, how has that changed has it changed your eschatological perspective, especially vis-a-vis things like these cycles of history?
I'm a 2018, so 7 years Orthodox convert, and if you're looking for expertise in Orthodoxy, you should not come to me. But I think the answer is somewhat, but not an enormous amount. That is, I was raised very Roman Catholic, and went to a Dutch Reformed elementary school, so I'm fairly good on theology. But I think that from an a eschatological perspective, certainly there's not a huge amount of if you're focusing narrowly on eschatology. But I think there's a little bit of it because for two reasons. Orthodoxy is kind of the most reality based of the major Christian denominations, in the sense that it tends to interact most appropriately with the rest of the world. Now, obviously, Orthodoxy's point is to be a light unto the nations and be the Church of Christ, and it's very secondary goal how Orthodoxy interacts with the rest of the world. But Orthodoxy does historically do a better job interacting than, say, Roman Catholicism with, for example, the secular powers. It's still a very imperfect thing, because that seems to be always historically the nature of any institutional church. How it relates to the secular authorities tends to be, on balance, usually worse rather than better. Nonetheless, its approach is, I think, based upon in human nature and in history more so than any other entity. So I think or institutional church. So I think there's an element, probably, I haven't really thought through this, but an element of Orthodoxy fits well into my own kind of political thoughts, simply because Orthodoxy has fit historically well into a variety of governmental systems, pre-liberal political systems. Obviously, Enlightenment type leftism, liberalism, is hostile to Orthodoxy, because Orthodoxy is reality-based, and those things are exactly the opposite of reality-based. And the things that leftism wants are inherently oppositional and increasing, and more so in kind of a ratchet effect. Just leftism, Enlightenment, liberalism is gone, you can easily Orthodoxy adopting. I've been saying for years that Orthodoxy is the king, but I think this is true, and I think this is part of it. That in a society that rejects Enlightenment liberalism, Orthodoxy is necessarily more attractive.
There's an interesting connection between the idea of apocalypse, meaning revealing, and then if you consider the church being the body of Christ and Christ being the Logos and the Logos being human, then as you get closer to reality, necessarily you're going to get closer to Christ, and you're going to get and it's going to have an apocalyptic effect as it's revealed.
Well, it's like, people, I think I agree, misuse the term apocalypse, which is rather than what people colloquially use it as. I believe he calls it catastrophe, cataclysm, apocalypse. So we're in the catastrophe, apocalypse is later. Back there I have an you can't see it, it's blurry, but an icon of Saint Michael of the Apocalypse, but we're not quite there yet.
Yeah, right. I was raised Seventh-day Adventist. Very devout Seventh-day Adventist for the first 20 years or so of my life. And obviously it's in the name. Seventh-day Adventism is very apocalyptic, very obsessed with the apocalypse. And being removed from it, firstly, just kind of sort of generic, unchurched, just kind of doing my own thing, and then moving into Orthodoxy, it's given me. It's like I've had the perspective of the very doomer future outlook. Everything is going to get worse and worse and worse. Seventh-day Adventists, their premise is there's going to be a national Sunday law where it is mandated by all the governments of the world that you have to worship on Sunday, and anybody who does not is going to be hunted down. And so their vision of the apocalypse is the remnant hiding in little holes as they're coming after them, and then Jesus appears in the sky. And so I grew up with that in my head.
Sure.
Extracting that bit by bit, I've realized how much of it has been subconscious for me, that I have this constant sense of there's a thing coming. We're at the end, we're coming near the end. But I started realizing that the effect that was having on me psychologically was it was like diminishing the importance of doing things in this life right here and now with this world. It was impossible to reconcile that perspective with creation being fundamentally good. It was created good. And so having the experience of occupying this one position and then moving to where I'm occupying almost the exact opposite position has been enlightening for me. But now I'm starting to recognize the effect of having a doomer perspective, the black pill perspective, becoming a self-reinforcing thing. And I think in order for, if we're going to win, if we are winning, and you seem very optimistic toward that end, not that winning means we're going to have a utopia, but that good things are going to happen that we like. It seems that it's necessary that we begin believing that be the case for that to ever actually be the case, which makes me see the doom black pill guys as actually working against their own ends. What do you think of that?
I think that's true. Like, I understand kind of the doomer impulse, but it's fundamentally an immature impulse because it's also one that's very ill-informed from a historical perspective. That is the doomer kind of society. So now, obviously, it doesn't seem imminent that any group, the left, the regime, whoever, is going to start banning Saturday worship. You know, it doesn't seem like a prominent thing, but it does. There's plenty of other things that they want to do, but the fact is that the history shows that doomer type regimes, or the type of regimes that doomers fear, have always had very short shelf lives. First of all, they're very modern kind of thing, ideological type regimes of that type that are focused on oppressing the people. And so when you point this out to others, they typically will fall, but what if arguments. These revolve around what I call the technological panopticon. Yes, in the past, it's been true that they can't really keep us all down, but with technology, they can keep us all down. You know, maybe, but that technology is a two-edged sword, and the fact is, the people aren't going to take it past a certain point. And yeah, you can say, well, we're an aging society, we're a feminized society, everyone's on, watching porn and smoking weed and playing games, and we're the based young men who are doing what it takes. Well, when it's time, so because that's in their nature, and you see this historically. So, being a doomer, and its logical end conclusion of this is pacifism. So you get a kind of quietist kind of thing, or a gray man kind of thing. The most sophisticated statement of this is Curtis Yarvin's kind of stuff. We should, I think, as Christopher Rufo once summarized it, something like, we should make sure we don't win now so we can not win later. And it was slightly different than that, but it was a really funny comment. And so you want the opposite. You want to not take the position that let's lose now so we can not win later. You want to take the position of let's work on winning now so we can win finally and put all these people out to pasture, or as I like to say, picking sugar beets in Saskatchewan.
Speaking of Yarvin, Yarvin was kind of the one that ultimately lured me away from being an ANCAP. He got that was actually what led me to Orthodoxy, honestly, was Monarchy. Being persuaded of Monarchy then made Orthodoxy just click right into place. Do you see using the Machiavellian Pareto scheme of the circulation of the elites? Clearly there's going to be a circulation. Regimes don't last forever. There's a lot of signals that this regime is on the downswing. People talk about the competency crisis a lot. I think the way the Texas border crisis was handled indicated a severe amount of incompetence among the Biden administration. And then the video that came out recently with James O'Keefe interviewing this cyber policy analyst and realizing like these are our elites here. This guy who is just one of the dumbest human beings you're ever going to encounter. These are our elites. These are the people that we're afraid of. Ultimately, an incompetent regime is going to be its own downfall, and the only question is how many people are going to get killed in the process of that downfall. Do you see any, as you look out, if we are anticipating some type of a circulation and potentially the rise of a counter elite, do you see something like that happening now?
To a limited extent, these things are always only viewable in hindsight. So I object strongly to what you might call the strong version of the circulation of elites, which is that in order for there to be a circulation of elites, you must first have an existing counter elite. And the reverse of that is true. That is, just because sometimes you do have an existing counter elite does not mean that you must have a counter elite. There are societies where there are continuously competing elites, and every so often one knocks off the other. Guelphs and Ghibellines kind of thing. Sure, I mean that's a perfectly plausible way to set up a society, but it's less true in the modern era. Everything politicized and energized. So, is there a circulation of elites? I think to a limit, or is there a borning group of elites? Well, of course, you and I are at the top of that. I mean, most people are. Right. Anyway, so aside from you and me, I think there's a little bit of that, but I think it's less visible than people would think. As always, these things are in the modern ideologized and politicized venues. It's less visible ex ante. That is beforehand. So you can argue like person ABC is part of an aboining elite. Elon Musk is part of the aboining elite. So I actually think that Elon Musk has an extremely high or very high chance of being a crucial element in breaking the regime simply because he has to. So that's a fairly safe bet. But like you can look at lots of other people that are out there and you can say, well, maybe those people are part of a future elite, maybe they won't be. Most of the members of future elite are unknown to us at this point.
What's up, Cooper? Welcome.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Mr. Haymaker. I apologize for being late. My superiors at work are spiritually homosexual, and the day I needed to be out at a relatively decent time, of course, they had bullshit for me to do. So here I am now.
Being spiritually homosexual is even worse than being a spiritual boomer. So hopefully they're not both.
Well, some of them are both.
Oh, not terrible. You need a new job.
Yes, I'm working on that. Are you hiring anybody?
I am not, because I am theoretically retired, though I have been casting about maybe starting a new business. So,
well, I'd like to become one of these new elites that you're talking about. So if you maybe can like put me in touch with some people. I am kind of smart. I have autism.
Well,
it's very useful.
One of the sad facts is that intelligence does not correlate to elite status, despite what again, particularly ideologized people like to think. Like, I'm smart, so therefore I should be in charge. This has historically not worked well.
I don't want to be in charge. I just want a lot of money.
Okay, well, in order to get the money, you probably have to provide elite type services or engage in some kind of corruption, which frequently leads to your head getting cut off. So maybe the former route is a better one.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the advice.
We've been doing some digging around here lately. See if I can get this out in a concise enough manner. We had this conversation for a while about the generations and the way that each generation seemed to be relating to the last ones, and then recognizing the particular personalities of the boomers versus Gen X versus millennials versus Zoomers. There's kind of a parallel between the boomers and the millennials. Like the millennials are almost like an echo of the boomers, and then there's a similar dynamic with Gen X and the Zoomers. And I got this a lot from talking to Cooper, who is himself a Zoomer, because I'm more of an early millennial. And I realized as I was looking at this, well, okay, the boomer ideology that has really ruled us a lot for I mean, I don't know, 40 or 50 years at least, maybe more. This naive boomer idealism, as I've termed it. There's a significant amount of that ideology that's going to die with the boomers, and the boomers have outstayed their position at the top relative to previous generations. They've been just as a kind of a happenstance of history, they've been up there for a long time with a lot of people backing up behind them. What do you think is going to be the influence or the consequence of over the next 10 to 20 years, all of the boomers, all of their wealth, all of the institutions that they've been the head of being redistributed to people who may see the world they don't necessarily subscribe to the same naive boomer idealist worldview?
I think the frame, well, the question is coherent and sensible. I think the frame is actually wrong, because the wealth of the boomers is not going to be distributed through traditional or normal channels. First of all, much of it isn't wealth at all. So, for example, much of the stock market is just fake. That is in Facebook stock is not real wealth. So at some point there's a reckoning, so that the amount of so-called wealth disappears, and then you're left with some amount of actual value. And in the nature of things, because if you're a happening bro, you think there's going to be happenings. One of those happenings is going to be redistribution of wealth, let's say on state of exception basis. And so I don't think that what's going to happen is the boomers are going to give their money to the Gen X kids or the millennial kids, and then those kids will take over and do whatever they're going to do. I mean, in practice, this relates to the circulation of elites. The value will be right-sized, distributed, and in practice, what that means is value will flow to the new elites and to the people who are part of the new elite structure, and stripped from people who are not part of that structure, or people who are directly targeted for punishment due to their behavior in the previous regime. Something I think is an absolute must. When I say things like truth and reconciliation commissions, which we certainly need, by reconciliation I mean punishment, not where people are get off when they testify. Instead, they testify and then they're punished. So, and one of the most significant punishments is stripping people of their ill-gotten gains, which is a huge percentage of the people who have money nowadays. So that's a kind of slightly off-kilter response, but I don't think the transfer of wealth from the boomers is going to follow historical precedents.
What I was driving at more was that as a matter of simple linear temporal fact, wealth, money, influence, power that is currently held by people who are of the boomer mindset, as a consequence of them all dying off, that wealth is going to be I don't want to say redistributed, but it's going to move into the hands of other people over the course of the next 10 to 20 years. And those new people who are coming up, this new elite, they're largely coming either from Gen X or Millennial, and they don't see the world in the same way as the boomers. So they're going to want to do different things with that money than the boomers necessarily did. And it seems to me that this is going to cause a larger shift generation to generation than we typically see, given the way the boomers have lived on as long as they have. I mean, the last 4 presidents have all been boomers. Go ahead.
Sure. No, I think it is going to be different. I just think it's very hard to predict how it's going.
That was going to be my next question. Yeah.
Certainly, Gen X is the greatest generation in human history, and is full of wonderful and talented people who are more than fit to lead the new elite. But whether that will in fact come to pass, it's impossible to say. Who should definitely not be the new elites are the young. I don't know exactly how you define as Zoomer. I saw some heinous statistic that among 18 to 29-year-olds, Biden has 71% approval rating. So, I mean, this is not.
Geez.
This is not so much a point about that generation. It is. It shows they're all morons. But it's actually, there's a deeper point there, which is, historically speaking, that age group is the most fickle. And so it's meaningless in this context, the context of this question, that 71% of the boomers like Biden. If Nayib Bukele showed up and started kicking ass, 90% of that age group was suddenly like Bukele, and they would see no contradiction between formerly liking Biden and now liking Bukele. That age group flips like a switch all the time. Nonetheless, it is going to be different. It's going to be different. It will be determined by circumstances at that time, which, as I say, favor significant change in the direction of right-thinking people, namely us.
Right. Recently, Jamie Dimon went to Davos. I don't know if you saw this. Jamie Dimon went to Davos, and he said that we need to start considering the fact that Trump was right. And the 3 things first of all, having Jamie Dimon say Trump was right, just those 3 words together was like, but then the 3 things he named off had me even more like, he said NATO, immigration, and the economy. And he went on the immigration issue. He said even all of his very liberal friends in the Northeast are all very unhappy with this immigration situation. Pair that with the fact that Bukele is what Bukele is and continues to be what Bukele is, and somehow his elections haven't been fortified. He hasn't been knocked off, knock on wood. And I don't know, 10 years ago, this would have seemed like a foregone conclusion that a guy like Bukele would never get to where he's gotten, because now he serves as a model that this sort of thing works. You can do this. This is something that's now been tangibly proved in the world now. So are we seeing? Are these things connected? The fact that you have Diamond saying maybe Trump was right, maybe there's some old money that's starting to reallocate itself. Is that connected to the fact that we don't see the typical happenings in Central America with the American intelligence communities?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, so El Salvador, I don't know, for example, what the opposition government structure is in El Salvador. My understanding is, for example, that a very large percentage of El Salvadorans are Pentecostal, an increasingly number who are very vigorous in their political approach and their kind of apocalyptic approach, and that leads to a lot of support for Bukele. So I don't know, for example, what the regime requires in other countries is some kind of set of people who can be suborned using money and NGOs and so on. And maybe that exists in El Salvador, maybe it doesn't. I just don't know. My knowledge from El Salvador is mostly confined, frankly, to like the 80s and 90s when they had a civil war against communist guerrillas. Now, I mean, for example, what happened to those communist guerrillas? I don't know. I mean, hopefully he tracked them all down and executed them. But, I doubt it. They're probably floating around somewhere. Or maybe they're in, I don't know, maybe they're in the US. So is there an opposition that can be used to suborn the political system in El Salvador, or is there just nothing they can work with? But I think that more broadly speaking, this just shows the incompetence and fragility of the regime. The regime used to be full of people who read Henry Kissinger's books and knew what history was before 1960. Now it's full of people who think that uplifting marginalized voices is the number one thing to do, and that self-executes any political outcome they want if they just throw a couple $1 million at some local NGOs who uplift marginalized gypsy voices in El Salvador, or some like irrelevant minority, and so they're just incompetent. I mean, they just cannot. I mean, you see this in the Ukraine war too. I mean, you give like hundreds of billions of dollars and you still can't get the result you want. I mean, of course, the Russians get a vote in that too, yes, they did manage to overthrow the government of Ukraine in 2014, but just the incompetence level is just shockingly high. It just is. I mean, even on the elements of the regime that are putatively not left, like the Republicans. You see this. The regime tools like McConnell tried to pull off this immigration bill, so-called immigration bill, and ended up with just total pie in their face, just like a bunch of morons. I mean, like, do you think that like competent politicians, like, I don't know, Huey Long, or I don't know, anybody from like the past years, no matter what you think of his politics, just wouldn't have let that happen to him? I mean, it just wouldn't. I mean, admittedly, they're used to a certain kind of control over the media and so on that is eroded with the internet and with X. Incompetent. They're all just incompetent, and they're just getting more incompetent, and that's good. And that's why I think that. I mean, that's part of the reason why I'm optimist. But if I'm Bukele, I'm like, well, whatever. I've been elected for 5 more years, and too bad. I mean, there are exceptions to this. Like Viktor Orban had to in Hungary, and I'm half Hungarian, so I follow that in particular. He had to back down and agree to give money to Ukraine because they were threatening him to basically try to destroy the Hungarian economy, which is very reliant on other aspects of the EU, both handouts and German automakers in particular. Nonetheless, so the regime is not utterly incompetent or utterly incapable, but I think largely incapable and largely incompetent, and you see evidence of that everywhere.
I know one thing that Bukele did, I want to say it was 2019, somewhere in 2020, somewhere in there, there was a bill going through their parliament or Congress or whatever their body is, and part of it was they were stonewalling him on providing funding to the military associated with his operations against drug dealers, and he marched the military into the halls of parliament and said, "You're going to pass this bill." Mm-hmm. And
yeah, Bukele. I mean, that's the guy you need. I'm always quoting what Cicero said of Caesar, that Caesar is a man of supreme daring, hardened to every danger. And there's just nobody like that in America. You can imagine some people becoming that. Again, back to Musk. I mean, Musk has many kind of debilities and weird psychological things and so on. But at the end of the day, all it requires is one guy who fits that description, because a guy like that is fundamentally unstoppable by normal means. Because especially in a situation like this, where everybody sees benefit from attaching himself to a guy like that, and some risk, obviously, to attaching yourself to a guy like that, but a lot of potential benefit.
There's a term that I encountered recently as we were thinking about this generational thing, and there's this Vivek Ramaswamy guy shows up, and I didn't pay him any attention for the first little while. Just kind of I called him Republican Andrew Yang. He didn't seem to interest me, and then I learned the term PayPal Mafia. And I was obviously familiar with PayPal. I was familiar with Thiel and Musk and their connection. And I found it very interesting, especially Thiel's association with Yarvin and his association with Rene Girard. And so they've always been kind of in the back of my mind as like, if something was to start happening, I would expect them to be intimately involved with it. And someone introduced me to the term PayPal Mafia. And I was like, I didn't even know that was a thing. It actually has its own Wikipedia page. So I went down and started studying all of the guys associated with it. Some of them are just insufferable shit libs. They are just like creatures of the regime. Reid Hoffman would be an example. Max Levchin, these kinds of guys, right?
Remember what I said earlier about punishment? Like in my spreadsheet of punishment, Reid Hoffman is like in the top 10 cells.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. So it's the PayPal Mafia is not a thing. It's not a single moving body. However, as I started digging through all the different companies they're associated with, projects they're working on, and then looking at the political connections between them, recognizing what Peter Thiel has been doing and how much of a long-term thinker that Peter Thiel is, I started realizing I'm sitting here playing like 2 to 3 degrees of Peter Thiel with all of these different projects. And several of these characters have public internet profiles. They're on Twitter. You can go listen to their interviews. There's the All In podcast with David Sachs and Chamath Palihapitiya, and I think there's one other. And then they also have Jason Calacanis, who is, he seems like a nice guy, but he's also a shit lib. I'm looking at these guys and starting to read through even just looking through all their Twitter likes and looking at the things that they're paying attention to. They're all very big China hawks. They're all very anti-illegal immigration, and they're very anti-DEI and ESG. These are all, core Silicon Valley insiders, and Silicon Valley typically has the veneer of being extremely, progressive shithole essentially. And yet all of these guys are beginning to even more loudly counter-signal the existing regime. And then you make connections with Vivek, and I realized, okay, this guy's the tip of a spear of something that's happening. And a lot of the things he's talking about directly parallel this thing, Project 2025, which is run by the Heritage Foundation and TPUSA, and like 80 other conservative NGOs. Now, typically that Project 2025 thing, when conservative NGOs get together and start coming up with some grand policy initiative or whatever, it's whatever, right, exactly. But I'm looking through what they're talking about, and they're talking about like abolishing federal bureaucracies, cutting down the workforce dramatically. And they're saying what happened with Trump was he got surrounded by people who worked against him at all fronts. So we're going to make sure that doesn't happen now. We're going to blitzkrieg. And so
unfortunately, he picked those people, but that's neither here nor there. I mean, it is
right.
I mean, that anyway,
right.
Yes.
What that does indicate, though, is that he is easily controlled if you have the right kind of leverage on him.
That's correct.
And if you listen to, I was very much a Curtis Yarvin guy, and then I liked Moldbug better than I liked Yarvin, but then as soon as I started seeing these kind of moves that were happening, I said this has the fingerprints of Curtis Yarvin. Whether or not people are like directly working with him or just even know who he is, but just they seem to have this sense that we have a crisis of executive power, and venture capitalists, startup guys, if there's one thing they understand, it's executive power, taking an inefficient system and making it stripped down and lean and efficient.
Well, as to Yarvin, I know Yarvin maintains contacts with some of these kinds of people, tenuous, and as do I, and so on. But whether or not he's influenced people, I don't know. I'm of mixed mind about Yarvin. I think Yarvin has done a lot of very valuable things. I'm also the author of the most notorious hit piece on Yarvin on the internet, a long screed, which basically points out that he doesn't know any history, and that he doesn't know any law or corporate structure or bankruptcy. But nonetheless, he's an original thinker. Some of his more recent stuff is not so great. he uses too many italics. But I'm not down on Curtis Yarvin. He's a valuable guy, and I think that if you were a philosopher king, you would do well to have Curtis Yarvin in your stable of philosophers. You would do poorly to have him as your only court philosopher, but he certainly could add value to your philosopher king court. I think that this goes back kind of to what you said earlier about the rise of a new set of elites. People involved in this too. I mean, obviously, one person not a play lately who I suspect is, in the right scenario comes very quickly to the fore is Eric Prince, who no doubt maintains contacts with all these people. I mean, I don't know that, but not being in this world, I mean, I've met most of these people, but I maintain no real contacts with these people, so I can't tell you what's really happening beneath the surface. I do think, though, from what I do know from personal knowledge, that there is a lot happening beneath the surface, and that there is a much more significant based Silicon Valley mogul setup than one might think. That doesn't mean that those people think like Haywood or think like Matt. I think that what it means is that they're on the journey to thinking 60, 70, 80% of what we think, because people who think honestly converge on reality, and they don't converge 100%. Obviously, they're going to see certain things differently, but they're going to reject outright all forms of leftism, root and branch. So, for example, let me just take a predictive example. Right now, Musk he's really down on illegal immigration, and he keeps saying, well, I want to increase legal immigration. It's inevitable that he'll come to the conclusion that if the other goals that he wants are to happen, that can't happen. That is, in order to have a civilizational renaissance with the kind of stuff that to achieve his goals, bringing in a bunch of other people it isn't going to cut it. Now, maybe you can bring in a few very select people for select uses that he can't find locally, but he'll come to the conclusion that even that is stupid, because it's a stopgap that doesn't build value for the future. You need to, for example, this is probably a longer term project, but you're Musk, you're like, I can't find any high-end STEM people in engineering. I can't find enough of them. And the reason is that white men who dominate in that, and for good reason, have been forced out of all of those starting at the elementary school level, have been forced out of engineering and technological achievement. They're not 100% forced out, but they're elevated. So women in particular are hugely forced into those positions, and men end up basically not taking a career path that would lead them to be the kind of people that are essential for Musk to reach Mars. So he's going to realize that at some point, that he has to rework that entire system in order to have the personnel in order to be able to achieve his goals. And that does not include bringing in immigrants, because that is a stopgap that simply won't fit the need. I mean, that's a 20 or 30 year thing. So, we'll see. But all these people will converge more or less. And the people who are execrations, like Reid Hoffman, they'll be thrown overboard or, out of a helicopter.
Did you see that there?
Yeah, go ahead.
Did you see there's a U.S. congressman who just made a Pinochet joke on Twitter recently?
That's what I was going to say. I mean, that goes back to our early conversation. That would have been, even 6 months ago, literally inconceivable, and it would have been national news, and the New York Times would have run big headlines. Now it's like dense pack. You probably don't remember this, but in the 1980s there was a theory about nuclear warfare, that the United States, and I think the Russians too, would place their silos very close together for land-based nuclear warheads. And the theory was that if it would make it harder to kill all the nuclear warheads, because the first warhead coming in would make the later warheads basically go off course. And so you'd be able to launch more warheads rather than having them all destroyed. Whether or not this is true, it was definitely a strategy. Whether or not it works, we don't know. But you get a dense pack kind of feeling here, where there's so much that's so bad for the regime that they can't afford to even spend any headspace on talking about this congressman, when in the past they could whip up a huge mob, make a weeks-long thing. How dare the right wing threaten to throw people out of helicopters? We must pass a bill in Congress. Whatever. They could make endless hay out of this, but instead they could make nothing out of it. And the congressman gave everyone the finger, and Twitter even left the tweet up. I mean, and so or the X up, whatever it is. And so again, we are in as they say, we are not in Kansas anymore.
That what you were saying about Musk and him eventually coming along with some of these, because these are reality-based things, and you have someone who indicates that the only way he could accomplish many of the things that he's accomplished and put himself in a position where he was the first person really counter to the regime who began making the types of moves he did. You could say maybe Trump before him, but he really is very unique in that sense.
Yes.
The only way you can do that is if you're very tightly connected with reality. You really understand reality. So if he has foibles, if he has departures from reality, if he wants to put chips in people's heads, and I don't like that idea, like that's fine. We can be fellow travelers. I get a very distinct. A lot of the doomers, the nothing's going to happen bros. I get a real distinctive, like the libertarians. You say, "Oh, that guy's not a real libertarian. He doesn't, he believes we should have driver's licenses, so he can't be a real libertarian." You get kind of the same phenomenon here, where it's like, well, if this guy doesn't literally share my brain, then he can't be my ally. It's one thing to say that if you're, an uber billionaire yourself. It's another thing to say that if you're Joe Schmo just firing off tweets on Twitter. Like, you got to have a little bit of situational awareness here.
Oh yeah, and I mean the chips don't really bother me because it's never going to happen. I mean those things are it's like strong AI, just a silly fantasy for people to sit around and talk about. Never going to happen, waste of time. Mm-hmm. But on a more concrete matter, you're Elon Musk, and last week they literally stole $55 billion from you. Yeah, and what he talked about in public was reincorporating. I'm pretty sure what's going through Musk's head is not how I can get my money back by reincorporating. It's some more, kinetic solutions to this problem, because that's just the way it goes. See, this is just a guy like that. It goes back to the definition of Caesar. At some point, you're like, basically, you've had enough. You have to pick your moment correctly. I mean, this is why famously, Caesar crossing the Rubicon and so on. You don't just smart people don't spend a bunch of time telegraphing their moves, nor do they take action at a time that is inappropriate. And of course, history is full of people who took action of whatever type at the wrong moment, and it bit them in the ass, and you never heard of them again. Or if you heard, it was like on their way to the gallows. But you pick a guy like Musk isn't going to start doing stuff that he's really saying the stuff he's really thinking about that judge with 55 billion until it's time to start taking action on that basis. But 55 billion is a lot of money, and people have changed the world for a lot less than 55 billion.
I think I saw that 63% of Fortune 500 companies are incorporated in Delaware. So that's 63% of Fortune 500 CEOs who are seeing what might happen to them.
Right. I mean, I used to be a corporate lawyer, and so a mergers and acquisitions lawyer. So I used to be very familiar with Delaware corporate law, but historically it was beneficial because it was error-free because of the competency, very fast. They had people available all the time to make decisions in complex mergers and so on, who actually knew something about complex mergers, and completely free of any kind of bias. And obviously, this judge and the entire thing is a political setup. It's a hack job by a political law firm with a political plaintiff funded by political people in order to steal from a regime enemy. I mean, in Roman times, these people, you'd be calling these people on their cell phones, and they would never be answering again. It works. That's what this is. I mean, this is just a vicious political attack, no different than things they're doing to Trump or whatever. It has nothing whatsoever to do with Delaware corporate law. So, and you have to kind of divorce yourselves, and I think lawyers in particular. I guess I'm the only lawyer here, but I have lawyer friends, and they still live in this kind of, well, the law is, this thing, and maybe occasionally it's not applied quite right. I mean, the law is irrelevant at every level of society at this point, whenever there's a political question. Criminal law with respect to violence, we saw that obviously with things like Rittenhouse and so on. And so pretending that the law is anything but a weapon to crush our enemies with and to ignore and destroy whenever necessary to do that is just a waste of time, because they're already doing that, and we need to do that, but times 100. Not that I'm getting about it or anything.
Of course not.
Actually, I did it back times 1,000.
All right, we got a super chat here.
Okay.
Ryan Isaac, $5. He says, "What incompetent regime behavior do you expect in the next 9 months? I.e., hard power use, or do you expect going through standard political motions?"
That is a good question. I can definitely say that once we get to the election, if Trump wins, it'll be, all hands on deck, left attempt to use violence to overturn the election. In the run-up, that's actually a good question. I think that they're going to want to not use incompetent hard power, for example, say the Texas border situation, but they will be unable to help themselves because there's always some set of people. Historically speaking, left activity is typically dictated by the crazies. And you see this over and over and over again, that you have a spectrum of people who have, in the left, some of them are sensible, some of them are unsensible, but the most ideological, the most politicized, the most radical usually get what they want because the other people have no limiting, in internal discussions, have no limiting rationale by which they can say, let's not do that. The only thing they can rely on are practical arguments. Like, this is an impractical thing to do right now, to engage in this kind of violence. And then the response is, you're not committed enough. You're not really a member of our group. You have this purity spiral very badly, typically in ideologized left movements, which tends to lead to irrational and unnecessarily aggressive behavior. So I would expect regime violence prior to the election, that is, use of hard power. The exact context can't be predicted, but there's any number of possibilities. And it's not just the stupidity of it, the desire to show we're in charge. It's there's going to be some set of people who are just on the left who are they're just so tired of taking that they won't be able to help themselves.
I was kind of gaming some of this out the other day, trying to think about, people like false flags or, some kind of, I guess there's a rumor that something's going to happen at the Super Bowl. And one of the things that seemed really present in my mind here is that the existing regime, the way they handled the Texas situation just was, it seemed like reactionary incompetence, the way they went about it. It didn't do anything except make matters much worse for them. They didn't like gain anything from that whole prospect. And the regime is it's a Fox regime, using Pareto's designations. They want to avoid use of hard power at all costs. They're trying to build up layers between them and the use of hard power. And part of the problem with that is that the more layers you build up, the more detached from actual reality you get, and there becomes a lag, and your behavior becomes more and more inefficient. And do you think that is this too white-pilled? Is there any possibility that as we're seeing the Jamie Dimons and coming out and saying pretty significant things, is there any possibility that this White House just becomes a lame duck White House that basically loses sufficient financial and corporate backing, people who just decide, all right, it's time to just make a deal with the devil and kind of pivot, and we just sort of just move into the election and Trump is elected and everything just sort of, the foxes kind of retreat back and decide to fight another day? Do you think there's any possibility of that?
There's always a possibility of it.
Yeah.
But it would be unbelievably anomalous by historical standards, because it also presumes a more centralized decision-making authority than actually exists. The behavior of the regime is a set of emergent properties of stupid people. And so this, for example, people have been saying for a year, and I've been saying this is stupid for a year, maybe they've been saying it for more than a year, well, they're going to take out Joe Biden and maybe Kamala Harris and put in people who are better able to win against Trump. And this is going to happen at X point or whatever. That implies that both that there's some set of centralized decision makers, which there isn't, and that there's no group of people who are reliant upon Biden and Harris being in the White House to line their pockets, be elites, be socially prestigious, whatever, that there's no constituency for keeping the status quo in place. And in a situation like this, keeping the status quo in place is by far the easiest position to maintain. You require an infinite amount of force practically to force a change in something like that. So you have no force and no centralized decision making. So of course Biden's going to be the nominee, unless he like literally drops dead of something, or he becomes a vegetable on live TV or something. I mean, even more of a vegetable. There's no mechanism for this to be dialed back. The people who are running they just can't help themselves. And you see this particularly in areas that are less kind of, they're visible, but you see this in the corruption of the Department of Justice, which is now run by hardcore left-wingers whose entire raison d'etre is to use the law in order to punish their political opponents. There's no way they're ever going to die forced to do so by removing them from the Department of Justice any power into, because that's just what they're there for. There's no possibility these people are going to take the tack and say, well, today I'm really going to spend my time on focusing on crimes committed by black people against white people, or I'm going to spend my focus on actual crime, because that doesn't fit their ideological worldview or the reason that they're in the Department of Justice. And so it's just never going to happen. I mean, the only way something like that could happen is if something superseded, again, the aliens. And just for the record, there are no aliens. There's probably no aliens in the entire universe, period. That's, if I was a betting man, I would say that, though obviously I can't prove it. But the aliens are not going to land, have not landed. There is no aliens. There are no aliens. And so something else might proceed. I don't know. And that might change the calculus. But assuming there's no seeding event, moon splits apart, an egg for a reptilian creature, that'd be kind of cool. But, short of that, we'll get what we're going to get.
This has been absolutely fantastic. We have got some questions that were posted in our Discord for the Kingfield Supporting Listeners group. Some people wanted to ask you some questions. I don't have it pulled up. I closed Discord to make sure we didn't have any streaming problems. So Cooper, give us these questions.
Question number 1. Mr. Haywood has in the past mentioned that Orthodoxy is, quote, the coming thing. Does he foresee Orthodoxy playing a significant role in the coming post-liberal West? What are his thoughts on the challenges related to the Orthodox enculturation of the West? How do we get from here to there?
Well, we get from here to there just kind of naturally. And the answer to the question, yes, I see it playing a significant part. How significant a part remains to be seen. But we touched on this earlier, that in a post-liberal political system, Orthodoxy is necessarily more attractive. Orthodoxy has historically had, not necessarily, it's been rare that it's had an excellent relationship with secular powers. Obviously, in America in particular, we have the organizational debilities of the Orthodox Church in terms of we don't have an American Orthodox Church. So that might well limit its ability to do so in America. I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but it's definitely true that in Russia, the Russian Orthodox Church has had a resurgence, and that has all the usual problems, but it also has the usual benefits. It's like that meme where you sit with Jimmy Swaggart, where it says like, Jesus, I see what you've done for these other people, and I would like that too. So, that's the kind of thing you're thinking of, or I'm thinking of.
Okay. Question number 2. I'd be interested to know what he thinks of Project 2025.
Well, we touched on that earlier. I had not heard of that. Normally, I guess we kind of said this already, but normally I hear about stuff like that, I want to vomit. But Matt's kind of convinced me that maybe I should hold the barf bag and take a closer look.
One interesting, I guess, kind of framing for it would be that Charlie Kirk, the goofball conservative cartoon character himself, had Curtis Yarvin on to talk about the idea of basically using your democratic vote to elect a dictator to do away with the people who are trying to destroy the country and restore constitutional government. made the case very interestingly to the boomer mind. But one of the things that Charlie Kirk dropped in that is that he spent last summer studying Machiavelli with Michael Anton. And when I heard that, I thought, okay, well, this is something, because I never would have thought I would have encountered Charlie Kirk talking about Machiavelli.
Anton is a prophet, and everybody should read all of Anton's stuff, but also in particular is his essay in New Criterion a couple of years back called Unprecedented, which is about the unprecedented nature of where we find ourselves in terms primarily of the rottenness and malice of the ruling classes. I will say, though, with Charlie Kirk and some of these other kind of normie-con people, again, back to our earlier point, they're saying things openly that in the past they would never have considered saying. And, I see some people on Twitter complaining about this. This is somehow bad. And I don't understand that argument. That argument is, obviously laughable. So we're just going to keep on keeping on because we're heading in the right direction. I feel good today. I felt good yesterday. I'm going to feel better tomorrow.
I love it.
Next question. When are you releasing an official foundationalism manifesto?
Oh, I already have a foundationalism manifesto. Come on, man. It's on the website.
Okay, but that's what I thought. But he's like, well, I thought he was going to receive, he promised a full book eventually. That's at least what this guy said. But, they're not the brightest.
No, that's on me. I have talked about having a book, but I have not written the book yet. In part because things keep changing on me. In part because I'm not sure it really has a ton of value. I mean, I spend most of my time when I'm not, oiling up my guns, doing hobby farming. I spent the day, tilling the soil for the spring because we had a really, really warm day here in Indiana. And sometimes I wonder whether writing a foundationalism book is more valuable than doing that.
Well, last question from our friend Mr. Buck Johnson. Mr.
Hello,
Haywood, which interview was more fun, Counterflow or King Pilled?
Ooh, they are
choose wisely.
They are both very fun. That's a good question. We covered some of the same ground. I was sober during both of them. So
is that uncommon?
No, I can't think when I drink. Like I'm normally very good at things like trivia, but if I have like even one beer, I can't recall like trivia. I mean, the speed of my mind decreases to a startling degree. In fairness, there is one podcast that of me when I did the one with Anton Reboy and Matt Peterson a couple of years ago. We did it after I've had a couple of drinks. It wasn't that bad, I don't think. They are both excellent and wonderful, and the host. That's my answer.
Good answer.
All right.
Non-committal, but that's a good answer.
One does not have to commit to a position on every single item of other people.
Well, do you have anything you want to direct people toward? Do you have anything else going on apart from the Worthy House?
I do not. Well, I mean, I have various things going on. I have a bunch of kids and so on, but no one cares about that. Politically, my political stance is actually, a wait and see kind of thing because the happenings are happening, and there you go. I mean, to bring it back to where we started, I don't like, unlike Curtis Yarvin, like I won't travel to go other places to like appear on podcasts, for example. Like people call me up and they're like, "Do you want to travel to this place?" I'm like, "No." I mean, I just don't. I mean, like, and so maybe that's bad, but I don't. I mean, to have less going on than I suppose I could. Like, I'm not building my brand adequately. If I had a brand manager, he would probably quit by this point because I just enjoy things like this. And, if you want to check it out, go read The Worthy House or follow me on Twitter.
Well, I strongly recommend you go read The Worthy House. Charles has a fantastic writing style. It's very terse, punchy, witty. It's like writing is performance art. He's also very insightful. Reads very interesting books. Very strongly recommend that. He has it available as a podcast as well, so you can listen to him read it. Appreciate you guys for showing up for the live show here. You can follow us on Twitter at Real King Pilled. Cooper's at Cooper Brooks. Please subscribe if this is your first time around here. We're going to be doing some more interesting interviews and some more interesting conversations here going forward, and we've got some fun stuff that we're working on. So we'd love to have you guys involved. You can join the King Pilled Discord at subscribestar.com/kingpilled. And you can join in the voice chats that we have there where we discuss all these same types of things. So Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Charles, for being here, and we'll talk to you guys next time.